I love my classes. I got a crazy teacher who wears dark glasses. Things are going great, and they're only getting better.
Thanks for sticking with us. This is part 2 of Module 2, where we're going to move from the nature of organizations to the nature of communication. Here is the working definition for, as far as I know, the entire department. Communication is the process of stimulating meaning in the mind of another via verbal and nonverbal messages. We're going to break this down just a little bit right now. First, I want to focus on the word process. Communication is not static, and it's certainly not unidirectional in almost all cases. It's a process where we have steps we go through to accomplish it. And the idea of stimulating meaning in the mind of others is really quite a challenge if you think about all the things that go into creating the meaning that you have in the message you're about to send someone, and all the experiences that went into how you were able to create that message, starting from the time you were born until the time you create that message, and trying to get that message to be the same in someone else's head so you can communicate effectively and functionally. It's really quite impressive that we actually get it accomplished at all. So that's the whole idea there, is shared meaning. Okay, shared meaning is what we call that, when we share a meaning that we created in our message with the other person. And the closer those are together, the more effective that communication was in terms of the sharing meaning. It might have created conflict or hurt feelings or created joy, but it was still shared. Also, we're talking about verbal and nonverbal messages. And for now, I just want you to think of nonverbal as everything except the words. So that also includes characteristics of the voice. Now, if you want to think about what's the definition of organizational communication, it's exactly the same, except we're going to add within the context of an organization. That's simple. Now, for our purposes, there are 2 factors to consider before moving forward. Many of you have probably, even as recently as an hour ago, called your degree the communications degree that you're working on. Okay, but there's a big difference. Look at those 2 definitions. Communication is the process of stimulating meaning in the mind of another with verbal and nonverbal messages. Communications is the process by which messages are transported from point A to point B. One has a very human focus, right? Think about the one on the left and what a human focus that has. But communications is really about the channel. It's strictly about the channel used to get the message across and any strategy associated with that channel. Or at least that's how we're going to think of it in this program. So I strongly encourage you to get a handle on that S, because it is definitely not part of how we label communication in our field, and certainly not then in our department. All right, let's take a look at the actual model of communication. Now, you have 2 in your textbook, the very simple one that is one of the very first ones that got popularized, but then you have one that's much more complicated and considers more factors, and I've created a similar version of that for us to use. We have a source, right? And that's this little cat here on the left with the bow tie, right? That's our source. And the source is who creates the message. And when you're creating a message, it's called encoding. The source creates the message in the context. That's what the blue circle represents. And that's kind of the setting. You can think of, as I think I mentioned in the nature of organizations, the setting overall is organizations, that organization. But obviously the setting can be the lunch table, for example. The message is created by the source within a frame of reference. And these little dots around the green guys and the gals are what I use to represent the frame of reference. And this means given the specific experiences of the source up until the moment that message is created and delivered. So if you grew up in Africa, your frame of reference for anything when you're using English to communicate with someone else is going to be totally different. Even if you're using Farsi to communicate, it's going to be totally different unless that other person also came from Africa and had a similar upbringing to you. Interestingly, the Japanese have this lovely phrase to describe this difference in our frame of reference from other people, and it's called enryo sashi. If you ever have an opportunity to look that up, I definitely encourage you to do so. Now, the orange circle represents the channel within which the communication is occurring. The channel is whether we're doing it face-to-face, whether we're doing it one-to-many like a public speech, whether we're doing it written on the telephone maybe. Whatever that channel is, that's how we're communicating. That's the means through which the message is shared. Now, during the entire message or communication process, a particular level of noise can occur, and that's represented by this big explosion here in the middle, and it can go all directions. Now, noise can be external, like the sound of someone moving papers around or somebody's music, but it can also be internal. Are you thinking about whether you should pick up your dry cleaning on the way home? Did your kid get home safely from school? How are you going to get all this work done? Then we also have feedback. As the other person begins to process your message, feedback begins to occur, and it often occurs before you finish your message. You can see the other person processing if you are watching and tuning into it. If your nonverbal sensitivity is strong enough, you can be tuning into it and finding out how the person is reacting to what you're saying, but also then as they begin to form a message, and sometimes even little verbal utterances such as uh-huh, mm-hmm, that kind of thing can also be feedback because it's not really another message. And the other person, of course, also has a frame of reference, and your message goes through that person's frame of reference. So if you think about it, like your message started in your head, it went through your frame of reference, it goes across a channel, through a bunch of noise, through someone else's other frame of reference, before that person decodes it to make sense out of it. And it really is a wonder that we ever actually communicate with each other effectively. All right, so that's the model that we're talking about. And hopefully you can see how it's not really static, because as soon as she gets the message, then hopefully, in this case anyway, she interacts and responds with her own message. But even before she starts talking, there's all kinds of dynamics going on. So that's the model, and hopefully you can see how it's not really static, because sometimes we are sending and receiving at the same time. In fact, that's often true. So it's a very dynamic process. Moving forward, let's very quickly look at the functions of communication. The first function is that communication functions to inform. Everyone needs information to get their job done, so it's an informative function. Communication also functions to regulate people in an organization. It's probably the most common tool used to ensure people are following rules. Communication is used to integrate work between departments. That's the third function. And the fourth is that communication is used to manage the work. An example of this is as simple as saying, hey, we should order more of those because the holiday shopping season will be here by the time that product arrives. Communication is used to persuade people, too. That's another function. That's how we get them to do what we want them to do. Yeah, the boss always has authority to make us do things, but savvy supervisors know that a bit of persuasion can get the job done with greater satisfaction. And finally, the last function is that it helps to socialize people into the organizational culture. So communication, for the lack of attention it gets often in organizations, is actually one of the most important tools we have. The last concept we're going to look at in this video is communication flow. Communication flows both vertically and horizontally in organizations. Let's first look at the kind of communication that typically flows down the chain of command. First is job instruction. We all need to be told, at least at the beginning of our jobs, how to do it. Messages about why we do things also flow down the ladder. Similar to that is communication about the ideology of the organization. And in this context, we're talking about usually the mission, sometimes the values. Obviously, information flows downward, and also feedback about employee performance often flows downward, although none of those are exclusive. People in leadership roles get a lot of information flowing up to them. So let's take a look at some recommendations for how to have the most success when sending messages up the chain of command. First, positive messages are better received and more likely to get action than negative ones. It's not always possible to be positive, but those are the messages that are likely to get more attention. Messages we send up the ladder should also be timely. Asking for a new laptop after budgets have been approved will probably result in disappointment. Third, messages that support current policy or changes that people at the top want to make are more likely to be well received. This might seem obvious, but it's really important to send messages to people who can act upon them. Sending a message to someone who can do nothing about it often ends with your message in the trash can. And finally, messages that have intuitive appeal, that good old-fashioned gut feeling or gut reaction, those are also the ones that are more likely to be successful. All right, that covers the vertical flow of communication. Let's quickly look at horizontal flow of communication, which is really quite simple. We're talking about how information or how important it is for information to be shared among people of the same level in an organization, your colleagues, your teammates. You might say there's some loose boundaries about what constitutes horizontal. Technically, it's people who are at exactly the same level, but certainly some of that is a gray area, a little bit up, a little bit below your level can often constitute horizontal communication. Horizontal communication in many, many ways is actually more important than vertical communication because without it, we don't learn about the culture of the organization, we don't get socialized in, and we know from years of research that without that, we eventually just leave or fail and get kicked out because we aren't part of the organization without that horizontal communication. So that concludes part 2 of Module 2, focusing on the nature of communication. I appreciate your time, and thanks.
Better. I'm doing alright, getting good grades, the future's so bright. I gotta wear shades, I gotta